Passive abilities are extremely critical in V Rising, and you're going to want to unlock these as soon as possible. There's going to be certain bosses that will unlock passive ability slots when you defeat them, and you definitely want to get the Elemental Awakenings and the Vampire Awakenings unlocked as soon as you can during your progression phase, because these are extremely impactful. And you'll be able to see my tier list over on the bottom right, and then I'll go through each one in order from the bottom to the top and talk about my reasoning in terms of their placement on the tier list. So for the first one, we've got Embrace Mayhem, which is going to be ultimate cooldown reduction rate of 14% and ultimate power by 10%. In V Rising, ultimates just take too long. They take like 100 to 120 seconds, and it's possible to completely waste them. Some of them you can get knocked out of and get zero value. Sometimes you just miss the ability and it does nothing. So ultimates just take too long, and it's too easy to mess them up. So like a 14 and a 10%, it's just not enough. These numbers would need to be 20% and 20%, like start by basically doubling both of them. Now, there are some builds you can do that center around ultimates and stuff like that, but I just don't like we want to do a tier list. We don't want to just put everything in B and C. So when I'm splitting hairs in order to rate some things high and some things low, Embrace Mayhem just isn't impactful enough. I'm not going to find myself using it in very many builds at all. Then as we move into the D tier, the first one here, we've got Chill Weave. Shields absorb 10% additional damage, and Breaking Freeze with a damaging attack triggers a Frost Nova that deals 40% magic damage and inflicts a chill. So, some of these skills can be extremely game-changing in like a PvP fight versus another squad or something, but my general rule of thumb when I'm doing an overall general tier list is if something's only good in PvP, I mean, that means it's not going to be useful for like 80% of players and like 90% of situations. Like most of the game, you're out farming or you're fighting bosses or it's casual players trying to progress. Now, yes, there are PvP situations where passives that are geared towards engagements with other human players are going to be extremely impactful, but if it's something that's only kind of good in those situations, I'm going to lower it in the tier list because of that. I want a passive that's consistent and usable in both PvE and PvP across the board with a wide range of viable builds. And Chill Weave just doesn't fit that criteria. It's, shields absorb 10% damage. Okay, that's pretty meh. Now, Breaking Freeze with a damaging attack, triggering a Frost Nova that inflicts chill, that's pretty solid, and it could be useful in very specific situations and specific builds. Not going to say it's trash. It's just got to be in the D tier compared to other passives. Then for Bastion, increase maximum health by 8% and reduce damage taken by 25% when affected by a crowd control effect. Pretty solid. I don't like the qualifier on the damage reduction. I would rather have the damage reduction just lowered to like 5 or 10% and make it permanent. That way it's just a good passive for a tank. You get health and you get damage reduction. But the qualifier of having to be affected by a crowd control effect, then you have things that cleanse those negative effects for you later on in the game. So then you're going to be like wiping away the Bastion. The 8% health is nice, but how often are we below 8% health while playing the game? Not very often. So Bastion, it's got consistent value, but it's going to be going in the D tier. Then Arcane Animators, 16% chance to summon a Skeleton Mage when a condemned target perishes. Now that is going to be nice because the Skeleton Mage is going to be better than the Skeleton typically. So very nice there, but 16% is kind of low and you have to kill something. But you also get the bonus of 12% bonus damage. So there are certain builds that would use this passive and it would get a decent amount of value, especially if you have like the Army of the Dead ultimate and you use it to burst down a fight or something with your ultimate on cooldown. Can be good, but again, it's not generally useful. It's not consistent, so it goes in the D tier. Dark Enchantment, increase a damage reduction by 4% and triggers a shield absorbing 270% of your spell power for 4 seconds when you take more than 30% of your max health in damage over the last 2 seconds. Now, this is actually a really good passive, especially for some of those tough V-Bloods that you have to fight in boss scenarios. What I hate, just in general in gaming, is I really hate ICDs, which are internal cooldowns. So that last caveat is what knocks this down to D tier, where it says may trigger once every 30 seconds. I hate that in gaming. I hate having to process these ICDs and keep track of them. I would rather just nerf this a little bit and then not have the internal cooldown of once every 30 seconds. If it was once every 15 seconds, I would move this up to B tier. If it didn't have an internal cooldown, it would probably be S or A. But Like, you're fighting a V-Blood, 30 seconds is an eternity. So you get hit hard, this procs once, great, that's amazing, but then you're just sitting there for 25 seconds and you're going to get hit again, and you're not going to get enough consistent value out of this. The damage reduction of 4% is nice though, so that's enough to bump it up into the D tier instead of F tier. Then into the C tier, we're going to start with Cold Soul. Increase spell critical power by 8% and deal 8% increased damage to chilled and frozen enemies. Again, we get a very good, consistent bonus here at the start of spell critical power by 8%. That's going to always be active and online for you. But the last part here on chill and frozen, you're going to have to proc it just to get an 8% increase of damage. It's okay. It just goes in the C tier. Then enhanced conductivity is kind of the same story. You get a very nice consistent effect of bonus spell power 7%. Then you get that little bonus of spell damage now also triggers bonus damage to enemies affected by static. Could be something you definitely want to take for like a high AoE farming build, like you're in Mortium and you're speed farming for the greater Stygian shards. Could be fun to use this, but it's just okay, C tier. Then Lethal Strikes increase physical critical power by 8% and deal 12% increased physical damage to enemies below 30% health. That last one being 30% is just too low. If it was increased damage to enemies below 50% health, I would move this to B tier. If it was below like 70% health, I would go up into A tier. But it's just too low of a qualifier. Like by then you're able to bite them basically. So Lethal Strikes, it's pretty meh. Then Ravenous Strikes increase weapon skill power by 8% and weapon skill leech by 5%. Honestly, this is pretty close to B tier for me. I'm gonna move it to the top of C tier. So you're going to be getting two things that are always online and always benefiting you, which right out the gate is very nice. And you're getting weapon skill power, which is two different abilities that you can spam and do damage to your enemies. And then also getting leech from those weapon skills, which is going to be a consistent source of healing. So this one could probably be in the B tier, but I like to do my tier lists even. I don't like to just flood the B tier with tons of things. So I'm going to keep it at the top of C for now. Then Spiritual Infusion, increase healing received by 12%, it's pretty okay. It helps you sustain for sure. And there's lots of good sustain builds around like leech and healing. Then 8% increased spell damage to weakened enemies. It's a little bit rough that you have to proc the weaken, but that's a pretty common thing in the game in terms of using coatings and different things like AoE Mosquito, proccing weaken. You can keep it up semi-consistent, so it's a pretty solid passive. Now up into the B tier, we're starting to get into the top half of the passives. Hunger for Blood, increase primary attack leech by 5% and increase damage against V-Bloods by 8%. So basically, you can slap this on every time you're going to be fighting a boss, and now that boss has 8% less health. So yeah, it's very consistent and very good for the situations that it's going to be used in, and you're going to be fighting a lot of V-Bloods in the game, not only in the progression phase of the game, but also for those tier 1 and tier 2 rifts when you're constantly fighting the Bloods at the end of the farming phase. Feral Haste, you could almost argue this belongs in A tier. We're going to increase movement speed by 4% and movement speed while shape-shifted by 15%. So the number one use of this is going to be like you want to chase something down, you swap into Wolf, you run past it, chase it down, come out of Wolf, and then start fighting again. I actually used this a lot in PvP when I'm going to be going into Mortium and I know I'm going to be facing other squads and getting into engagements with other players. I would be having a lot of situations where someone's trying to run away. I drop down into wolf form, chase them down, run past them, and then I'm able to go ahead and finish them off and kill them because they're not able to get away from me. They don't have time to get on their horse, and I get this buff to my movement speed and my mobility by being able to go into wolf form. I think what would bring this up into like A tier or S tier for me is if it also helped you jump into wolf form faster. Like it, if it was like a 25% reduction to the time it takes for you to transition to wolf form, now we're talking S tier. So yeah, this is just a really impactful passive for PvP especially, but also in PvE. And I mean, you can't go wrong with 4% permanent movement speed. Blood Spray, increase physical critical chance by 8% and critical strikes leech 5% health with a 25% chance to spawn a blood orb when killing a target affected by leech. Again, they have to be affected by leech, which is pretty rough. I'd rather have this just be like 10 or 15% and then remove the has to be affected by leech. That alone would make this an A tier passive, but it is pretty solid if you're going for a physical weapon build and you want to be based around like leech and healing and sustain, and Blood Spray could be a really good option. Lightning Fast Strikes, increase primary attack speed by 7% and static triggers deal 20% increased damage. I love attack speed just in general in games because the more attacks you're getting in, the less overkill damage you're going to be doing. Like I would rather do 10 really fast attacks that don't hit very hard as opposed to like 3 attacks that hit super hard, because especially when you're farming, you're going to do a lot less overkill damage. You're going to waste a lot less of your DPS. So I love attack speed, but it like has to center around only static, and then it's going to trigger a little bit of increased damage. It's okay, it's B tier. Rampage, increased physical critical chance by 8%, and physical critical strikes grant 12% increased attack speed for 4 seconds. That is very strong. You can basically keep this up permanently because you only have to critical strike something every 4 seconds in order to keep this up. So what I'm finding when I use this in builds, I can keep this buff online like 85 to 90% of the time, especially if you're doing a good job stacking crit, which this helps you stack crit. So it is a very cool passive. I love the design of it, and it's almost A tier for me, but it's definitely, I'm going to actually move this up to the top of B tier. Let's slap this over there, and this is another one where I think you can make a case that it should go up as well. And then rounding out the B tier, we've got Soul Drinker. Increase the feed cooldown rate by 24%, and using Bite summons a Skeleton Warrior. I think this would actually be really good in certain builds, and especially when you're out in the world speed farming and you're blasting through a ton of trash mobs consistently. This one would actually be a lot of fun. It's going to be going in the B tier. Then for the A tier, Hungering for Power. Increase Spell Leech by 5%, and using Bite increases your movement speed by 15%. And your spell power by 15% for 5 seconds. And this is one that's actually really underrated by a lot of people. When you are out farming and you're just blasting through enemies, you're gonna be able to use your Bite a lot, and you're gonna basically have a permanent 15% movement speed while you're fighting, and then you also get the spell leech and the spell power. So this is just an insanely consistent passive for you. The only reason it's not going to be going into the S tier is because it's going to be basically trash against bosses. Now you do at least get the permanent effect of the spell leech, but to really unlock the power of this passive, you need to be speed farming and killing lots of things to utilize that Bite consistently. And there is actually a passive that helps you synergize with the Bite, and the one that we just talked about recently here with the Soul Drinker, where it's going to increase the feed cooldown rate of 24%, and you're also going to be constantly summoning those Skeleton Warriors when you do Bite. So those are a really cool synergy to do with each other, with the Soul Drinker here and the Hunger for Power. So I think they belong up there in like the high B, A type of tier, because it can be really solid in most content. Then Overpower, increase weapon cooldown rate by 7% and weapon charge gain by 6. This is just super consistent. Any sort of physical weapon cooldown cycling build is going to take this one. So it's just got 2 very permanent effects that are going to be constantly helping you, and it's going to be viable for many different builds. It's a solid A tier passive. Sanguine Mastery, deal 8% increased physical damage to enemies affected by Leech, and boost the effects of your current blood type by 8%. That second part is super cool. Later on in the game, especially when you have the homogenizer and like 100% blood, your blood is going to be insanely impactful. So just getting an 8% bonus to your blood, you could almost argue that alone should go into S tier. I don't like that it deals increased physical damage to enemies affected by Leech. That's 2 kind of rough requirements, because you have to be a physical build and then you have to affect them with Leech. So it's close to S tier just because of the blood type effect. It's a really cool passive. Turbulent Velocity, increase movement speed by 4% and gain 4% additional movement speed for 4 seconds when dealing damage to an enemy. Now, again, this is really solid, really cool. Anytime we can get movement speed, that's great. And we can basically keep the second bonus up permanently, because we're going to be getting additional movement speed for 4 seconds when damaging an enemy. So this is going to be great in PvE, PvP, versus bosses, versus trash mobs, and I could almost argue Turbulent Velocity goes into S tier. I'm actually very close to moving it up there, but yeah, there's lots of builds, lots of scenarios where Turbulent Velocity would be very good. And there's a lot of times that when I'm out doing farming, like for Gradier, Stygian Shards, I will actually pair Turbulent Velocity with Hunger for Power. And then anytime I'm hitting things and biting things, I'm just constantly getting movement speed buffs here temporarily that I can keep up basically permanently. Then Wicked Power, rounding out the A tier. Increase spell critical chance by 8%, and spell critical strikes have a 50% chance to inflict a random spell school effect. I actually think this one is super cool. Again, this is a close one to S tier, but I didn't want to put like 7 things in S tier. I'm trying to make an actual comprehensive tier list. So the random spell school effects are going to be your things like Static and Condemn and Weaken and Leech. Like each tab kind of has its own colored, like red for Leech and all that. So a 50% chance on a critical strike is actually pretty high, and then it synergizes with that by providing you a bonus of critical strike. So this one's going to have permanent value in all content. It's a very solid passive for many different builds. Alrighty, then into the S tier, Chaos Kindling. Increased spell cooldown rate by 7%, and Ignite deals 25% increased damage, while Chaos Explosions ignite enemies hit. So obviously cooldown is always amazing, and you just get 7% of that. And then Ignite dealing increased damage is pretty cool because there's actually a lot of builds where you use Ignite procs as a source of sustain and healing you from enemies that are under Ignite. So this one is just super cool, and there's some very strong builds that synergize with this, and cooldown is just always going to be one of the best things. So no surprise here that I've got Flowing Sorcery with the spell cooldown rate of 7%, and then also a 35% chance to not consume Phantasm when triggering a cooldown reset. So the reason spell cooldown rate is so impactful is because all builds are going to be utilizing it. So even with some of my melee builds, I want spell cooldown rate, whereas the opposite is not true. Like, I don't really care as much about weapon cooldown rate when I'm doing like a ranged caster build. So spell cooldown is just way more impactful, and you need it a lot more often. So the two passives that give you spell cooldown rate are just gonna be S tier because they can go in almost any build and be extremely consistent and extremely useful in almost any situation, helping you hitting those stat thresholds. And then lastly, we've got Renewing Flames, which is going to be 8% spell damage to enemies affected by Ignite, and Ignite heals you for up to 25% of your spell power. Remember, I was talking about there's lots of great synergies with that. So whether it's a ranged build or a melee build, very good synergies exist in the game to help you heal and sustain off of Ignite, and both of these are going to help you kind of unlock that synergy in lots of different play styles around lots of different content. So it's a very cool kind of passive synergy here, whether you use one of them or both of them. So okay, now let's talk about, after talking through this here on the video, is there anything I want to change? You know what, I might move Renewing Flames down to A, because again, you have to be using Ignite, and then it's going to be only sustained. So I might move that down a little bit, and then I might move something like Turbulent Velocity up to S, because it's just amazing constant increase to your mobility. So I think I'm going to make that one adjustment here at the end. And then after that, I feel pretty good about it in terms of version 1.0 here of my passives tier list. Now, if you want to join the Discord, I will keep this stuff up to date, and I'll always have it kind of posted in the resources channel. So if I adjust this tier list, or I hear better arguments from other people and all that, I will adjust and then update accordingly. And then I can do the video. If there's significant changes, I can redo like a 2.0 rankings video. Maybe there's a patch or something that changes some things, or new passives come out and stuff like that. So yeah, subscribe if you enjoy V Rising content and RPG content in general, because I love deep diving on games like V Rising. And you can head on over to the Discord and tag me or chat if you ever have questions or suggestions and all that good stuff. I'll link to it down below. So have a good rest of your day. Thanks. Cheers.